Hello, my name is AJ Goldsby. I'm a life master from Pensacola, Florida, and I wanted to come to you today to bring you another one of my videos in a series of videos that I'm doing on the Chess World Championship. This is game number 9 in this series, and it was played between Viswanathan Anand, the Indian fellow who was the current world champion prior to this match, was white, and Magnus Carlsen is black. He's playing black pieces in this game. This game was played on November 21st. Again, this is game number 9 or round 9, and it was played in Chennai, India. And without any further ado, we'll go ahead and get into the game. Starts off well, let me give you a little bit of background first. It does start off D4. I don't know how closely you follow this match. It started off with a couple of fairly routine draws. Then there were a couple of fighting draws, and games 5 and 6 were both decisive, which Carlsen managed to win both games. In game 5, I believe he was playing the white pieces, and in game 6, which was the critical game, and in game 6, he was playing the black pieces. That should have been a fairly routine draw. It was a rook and pawn ending. I see no excuse at all for Anand losing that game other than simply Carlsen seems to be a very shrewd psychologist. He seems to understand where and when to apply the pressure, and I think after having won game 5, he maybe came to the board and saw that his opponent, wasn't feeling well or didn't sleep well or looked disheveled or whatever it was. He somehow seemed to sense that that was an opportunity to play a really hard game, and it paid big dividends in that game. But anyway, and game 7 and 8 were both draws, although not without some fighting content. So now I'm up to game 9, and this is a decisive game. But this is an extremely interesting game. Anand is white, and being it's a short match, only 12 games maximum, he had to absolutely try to win this game. It was one of his last few whites, and he basically had to win 3 out of 4 games, I think, at this point, to even have a chance of tying up the match. And it probably wasn't very likely a scenario. I mean, Anand's a good player, but Carlsen is just playing too well. The computer analysis shows that he's not playing mistake-free chess, but he certainly is a lot closer to the goal than Anand. And one thing that he is doing that Anand is not doing is he seems to be avoiding the really big mistakes. So anyway, without any further ado, we're going to get into the game. Starts off D4, knight f6. Again, Anand is white and Carlsen is black. C4, E6. And you have to remember, too, that Carlsen has a 2-game lead, so Anand must play for a win. So a lot of normal lines are going to go by the wayside, and that means he's got to somehow steer this into a very sharp game and produce some fighting chess. Knight C3, bishop B4. This opening is known as the Nimzo-Indian opening. The coverage for the Nimzo-Indian opening starts on page 536 of the MCO, Modern Chess Openings, the 15th edition. And now Anand as white plays a very interesting move. He plays f3 here. Just quickly reviewing the game, the first few moves was d4, knight f6, 2c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. Again, this is the Nimzo-Indian defense, and in this particular game, Anand played one of the sharpest lines. I think it was a good choice. He played 4f3. That's a good choice because A, it's very sharp, and B, I think it's less explored than a lot of main lines. And like I said, if you're interested in researching this opening, I suggest you do several things. Number one, go to the www.chessgames.com. They have an excellent Explorer, especially if Openings Explorer tool. And if you're a premium member, you can really deeply explore the openings and find out what the main lines are, and research those very carefully. You can go to one of my websites, www.ajschess.com. I have both the Game of the Month and my main chess website there, AJ's Chess homepage. And on those, you'll find dozens and dozens and dozens of annotated games, and I'm sure you'll find many examples of the Nimzo-Indian. And of course, on page 536 of MCO 15, you're going to find the Modern Chess Openings. You're going to find very good coverage there by many grandmasters. The main grandmaster that wrote that book was Nick DeFermian, But really, that book is a collective work of dozens of masters, put their input into that book. So it's a very well put together book, and I think of all the references, it's one of the references. No opening reference is perfect, but certainly that has got to be one of the best of all the available ones. Just very quickly, of course, I study chess all the time, and just very quickly, I'm going to give you some alternative lines here. The main line would be the Rubinstein system. The Rubinstein system is signified by the move 4e3. Black usually castles, bishop to d3, d5. Now, black can play c5 there, but d5 is, one of the main lines there. Knight f3, c5. White castles, and black plays knight c6. Now, this is both a very old line and a very new line. I think it was first played back in the 40s or 50s, so it dates back many, many years. Some very notable games that were played in this position was probably number one, probably the first one that comes to my mind would be the very first game of the Fischer-Spassky match in Reykjavik, Iceland in 1972. The very first game featured an Nimzo Indian. Spassky was white, Bobby Fischer was black, and in that game, Fischer overreached and tried to force a win in a fairly drawn position and wound up losing a fairly long game. That was the first game of the Fischer-Spassky match. Garry Kasparov, some people say Kasparov, but I believe the correct pronunciation of his name is Kasparov, played a very good game. It was a fairly long game. It was 60 or 70 moves, and he defeated Vladimir Kramnik in a very good game. And I believe that was one of the Linares tournaments in the late 90s. I'm going to say 1996 or 1997. I think it was the 14th Linares tournament. I was looking at the game. It's been a few months back. In fact, actually, I studied that game very closely a couple of years ago. It's one of the better games played all time. It was a very fine game. Of course, Kramnik is a former world champion, as Garry Kasparov at that time was a reigning world champion. And that was just before Kramnik, about 3 years later, was to wrest the title away from Garry Kasparov. So that was a really excellent game. Like I said, the game went 60 or 70 moves. So that's a good game you could study. Also, too, a couple of recent games I studied. A couple of games that I've studied recently was one of the games I studied recently was a game between who was white? Tomaszewski, I believe, was white, and Oleg Romanishin was black, and that was at the 13th European, I believe it was the individual championships of just this year, 2013. So that's just a few games that if you wanted to look those games up and have a look at those games, then you could do that. Another line, another alternative to f3, this again is after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. Another alternative is what some people call the Capablanca or classical system, and that's queen c2. The main idea being there, of course, is to prevent the double pawns. If black takes immediately with the bishop, the queen can recapture. And the main line there would probably be castles a3, bishop takes c3 check, 6, queen takes c3, knight e4, queen c2, and f5 is certainly one of the strongest and most trusted lines there. Just a few games that come to mind here that I've looked at recently within the last few months or last year or so. I know that for sure that Carlsen lost a game in this position as white to Nakamura. I believe that was in 2009. And also, too, there was a game from the 2008 to 2009 Bundesliga tournament, which is a team tournament, team championship that they have in Germany every year. But in the Bundesliga, in that season, I believe it was Bart Sacco. He's a grandmaster from Poland. He defeated Kirill Georgiev in a very long game that went nearly 100 moves. It was 90-something moves. I don't remember exactly, but I remember it might have been close to 100. But anyway, it was a very, very long game, and it made very interesting analysis with the computer. And another game, too, that was played recently was Zhao Wiki, I believe his name is, and he beat another player. Believe his last name was Batoon. And that game was from the 2009 or 2010, I believe it was the Asian Continental Open, but it was a Chinese player. His name is Zhao Weiqi or Zhao Wiki, W-E-I-Q-I. First name is Zhao, Z-H-A-O-U. But anyway, that was a very interesting game. So if you wanted to go to the Chess Games website, or if you have Also, you can access the online database of the Chessbase. Chessbase has their own online database. It's a JavaScript screen, but you can pull up virtually any game that was played as long as you know the correct spelling of both players. And if you really want to research those games or study those games, especially with an engine, you can see how grandmasters approach and tackle those positions. Oh yeah, one more game too. I believe it was in the first line there, in this first line here, in E3 castles. Bishop d3, d5, knight f3, c5, castles, knight c6. Going back to that line, the classical line, which is 4e3 is the Rubinstein system, there was a very good game. I believe it was Wang Ho defeated Hu Yaifan, and that was at this year's, the 2013 version of the Tata Steel, or Wick, what some people call Wick on Z. The Wick on Z tournament in January and February of 2013. That pretty much concludes my opening survey there. I just wanted to give you some ideas and some lines. Again, if you want a really deeper analysis and to see the lines pursued all the way out to their logical end, and what the opening books say about those, then I suggest you find one of my web pages. Just one of my many web pages, I'm sure. If you can find a game that I did in the Nimzo Indian, I promise you're going to find complete coverage. Like I said, the two best places to find those games probably be either my Angel Fire website, one of my Angel Fire websites, my opening school, www.ajschess.com, which has both my my homepage, my chess homepage, and my Game of the Month website. And on both of those two websites that I just mentioned, you're going to find literally dozens and dozens and dozens of annotated games. And in one of those, all you have to do is find an Nimzo Indian game that I've annotated, and you're going to find a complete coverage of all the opening systems, latest up to date, what the latest game is, what the latest theory is. A lot of times I, pull information off the very latest stuff, articles from Chessbase, the latest DVDs, that sort of thing. But anyway, going back to our game here, that was a sort of an opening survey, if you will. We're just going to continue now on the actual game. Getting back to the Anand Carlsen game, the opening was d4, knight f6, c4, e6, 3 knight c3, bishop b4. Of course, this is a Nimzo Indian. And now Anand plays f3. And I believe, again, the main reason that he did that was because this is the sharpest possible, opening line. He wanted to play something that was A, sharp, and something B, that was relatively unexplored. Carlsen counters with one of the main lines, one of the most trusted lines against f3, and that's to play early d5 there. Very solid line. Maybe not the way I would choose to play against the Nimzo Indian. There I would probably try to play black plays c5 here, c7, c5. The idea being there that you want to, leave possibly white with the doubled pawns and try to exploit that later. That's the original concept of Nimzovich when he invented this opening. But Carlsen plays a perfectly acceptable move. In fact, this is the main line according to the Power Book, is d5. And obviously you're striking at the center. And now white plays a3, bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, c5. And now c takes d5, e takes d5, e3. Now here Carlsen plays something a little bit interesting. He deviates from the main line. The main line, which is probably interesting for both players, is castles, bishop to d3, b6, 10, knight e2, bishop a6, white castles, rook e8, bishop takes a6, knight takes a6, queen d3. There's been dozens of master level and grandmaster games that have been played with these moves. All you have to do is look this position up in any database, and white here has a very, very small edge. It's not huge. The computers actually evaluate this as close to equal, but I would say practically speaking, white has a slight edge, especially black's development isn't perfect. He's weak on the light squares, and he's also going to lose a tempo with his knight over there on the corner. It either has to go back to white. Black either has to play knight b8, knight c7, or queen c8. One of those moves has got to be forced there. So anyway, it's just so he doesn't hang a piece on a6. I would say white has a very, very small edge in that position, but again, you could look up that position in any database and find out how that position was played. You can probably find games where black won and also find games where white won, and explore that. That's the way I like to study the opening, is try to go over 3 or 4 games where each side wins a good game, between two fairly high-rated players, at least FIDE 2400 or better. So that way, that gives me a good idea of how really strong masters might handle a certain type of position. But anyway, going back to the actual game, d5, a3, bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, c5, c takes d5, e takes d5, e3. Carlsen plays c4. Give that move an exclam question mark. In other words, interesting. It's not totally unsound. It's a little bit dangerous in my opinion because black's ignoring his he's ignoring his development. He's also, possibly overextending his pawns. But on the positive side is white wants a wide open position because he has the two bishops. And this move is a very trying move for white because I think white's trying to get a very wide open position, and black by playing c4 is basically shutting down the entire queen side. It's very difficult for white's bishop, especially on this diagonal here, the f1 a6 diagonal, for that bishop to become active because this pawn here just locks everything down. These two pawns lock down c3 and d4, makes it harder to get the dark squared bishop into the game. White's got to try to break e4 as quickly as possible, etc., etc., etc. So this is, probably why Carlsen chose this move. Maybe if he wasn't leading the match, he might have played something different. I'm sure he had this prepared. I'm sure this was part of his pre-match preparation. One of the things I did notice in this match and watching the videos of the actual games was that Carlsen, most of the time in the opening, played his opening moves relatively quickly, much more quickly than Anand did most of the time. And he definitely came with this prepared. So that's number one. And I would say probably overall that Carlsen was much better prepared than Anand was. He seemed to use less time in the opening. I noticed that. And also, too, that I think he had more than one idea prepared. I'm sure that if he'd been trying to play for a win in this position, maybe c4 wasn't the move that he would play. Or maybe he played that because that was part of his match strategy, was try to contain Anand and pressure Anand and take away his tactics, because Anand is a very great tactician. So maybe Carlsen was purposely playing in a manner to restrict the Indian chaps, Anand's, the world champion's tactical ability. So there's a whole number of questions, and without asking Carlsen some specific inquiries, I would never be able to tell you exactly what his match strategy was. And certainly he didn't reveal that, especially before the match, to anyone. I mean, that was probably known only to him and his trainers and his second, which was, I believe, was the Grandmaster Hammer. But anyway, so c4 is an interesting move. Probably not the main line there, but it certainly is a very trying move, and probably not the one that Anand, psychologically speaking, it's a very good choice, I think, because it's not the one Anand would want to see. Anand probably wanted as wide open a game as possible. He wanted as many tactics as possible, which means Carlsen, is also playing, a little bit of psychological chess here. He's using psychology, and I think that also became evident in the match that Carlsen was a very shrewd, natural player, that he seems to notice when his opponent is up, notice when his opponent's down, and maybe even pick the line that maybe might bother his opponent the most. And in that way, he reminds me a little bit of the second great world champion, Emanuel Lasker. But anyway, getting on with the game, white responds 92. He's got to develop his knight. Part of the problem that white has here is that normal develop isn't possible. In other words, normal development would be moves like knight f3 and bishop e2. But of course, knight f3 isn't possible because there's this pawn on f3. White doesn't want to play f4 because that gives him a huge hole, makes him weak on the light squares, makes his dark squared bishop a very bad piece, and creates this huge hole on e4 for black's knight and all his other pieces. Black simply castles, plays rook e1, bishop f5, and he comes out of the opening with a huge advantage. So that's just not possible. So it means what white has to do is that, and knight h3 probably isn't going to be played because simply bishop takes knight and pawn takes bishop, and white's already coming out of the opening with a horrible, ugly set of isolated double pawns on the edge of the board. So that's not a possibility. So what I'm telling you is that normal development here simply is possible. White's going to have to move his knight twice just to get it to a decent square. So once you understand that, then you can kind of understand why white plays his very next move. Obviously, Anand, playing for a win, would like to play classical standard chess. He'd like to just play a line where he can get his pieces developed much more quickly than his opponent. But part of the problem that he's having is he's running up against a very well-prepared opponent, and his opponent isn't going to allow him to play that kind of chess. So basically, Anand's just got to do the best he can. And one of the main lines here for white is knight e2. And again, that's within the confines of the position. This knight's going to go to g3, and then the bishop goes to e2. The bishop obviously would be happiest on the d3 square, but it can't go there now because of this c4 move. And that's one of the main points of this c5 c4 line is that it restricts, white greatly, and natural development is greatly inhibited. So anyway, white's ninth move was knight e2. Black develops knight c6. One thing you notice about black is black's not having hardly any development problems at all. g4, black simply castles. And now white plays bishop to g2. So now we see exactly what white's trying to develop. Since he couldn't develop his pieces on this line, now he's playing here. Now going back just one move, let me talk a little bit about g4. Why did white play g4? Well, that's the #1 move of the power book and a lot of the DVDs here. So it's easy to say, well, that's just the opening move there. It's the correct move for white. But I think the average player would probably like to know, why is that the correct move? Again, understanding that white can't play simple, normal developing moves. He's got to develop his light squared bishop somewhere. It can't go to e2. It really is obviously impossible to go to d3 as long as that pawn is on c4. So basically, white's got to develop somewhere else. White would like to, if he could just pick things up. If he could just pick this light squared bishop up and move it over to c2, that would be a great square, a fantastic square for the bishop. But obviously, #1, that's not a legal move, and #2, it's not even possible, the rules of chess. And #2, it's going to take many moves for the bishop to get to the c2 square. The knight's got to get out of the way, the queen's got to get out of the way, the bishop's got to go bishop e2, bishop d1, bishop to c2. So you're talking about 5 or 6 or 7 moves, practically speaking, before that bishop ever arrives in that diagonal. So the loss of time that it would require to get the bishop to that square simply makes it not worth to try to do that move. So basically what white's got to do is try to, he's got to try to gain a little space. And g4 is a very excellent move, because one thing black wants to do, and here's something else too that I explained to one of my students recently, and I think every chess player, once you understand this, then you can really start playing a much higher level game right away. Every chess game that I've ever noticed between two strong players, there's always a dialogue that goes on. And by dialogue, I mean, for example, here is black. Very obviously, black's next move, if he's left unimpeded, he should probably castle, place his rook on e8, and then maybe play his bishop to f5. Just these are natural squares. These are easy squares for black to play his pieces to, and it would give black a fairly decent piece arrangement, and then he could rush his heavy pieces into wherever the open files or wherever the targets are at, half open files, and finish his development. Those moves would come easily, come naturally, and be very easy for black to play. In fact, if I were black, I would probably castle, play rook e8, play h6, and then bishop to f5, and if white played g4, I could fade the bishop all the way back to the h7 square. And those moves, if white allowed me to play those moves, then I could play those moves quickly and easily and be relatively confident that I was going to get a relatively good game. Maybe those aren't the engine best moves, but they're certainly natural moves, and they certainly cannot be terrible moves. So once you understand that every chess game contains a dialogue and your opponent is always striving to get his pieces to certain squares, then once you understand this dialogue, in other words, one player says, I want to do this, or I want to go to this square, then the other player should try to make that impossible if he can. So g4 is a very natural move. It gains space. Chess is a war of 4 basic elements: space, time, force, material. Space is the squares on chessboard. Time is the idea of you move, I move, and time is built into not only chess, but practically every board game that man has ever played. Force is very simply defined as any time any piece exerts capturing power on a square. That's the only correct definition of force, and logically it's also the simplest. And also now material. Now material, here's where I differ from the Russian system. The Russians recognize space-time force. That's just too logical, and it's too obvious to get by. But where I do differ greatly from the Russian school of chess is they do not recognize material as being one of the basic elements. Simply put, they try to say pawn structure, king safety, a lot of other things are basic elements, and anytime you can even create a game or have a position where one of the basic elements is missing, to me, then it's not a basic element anymore, simply by the definition of the word. So to me, an element is something that is always present, and I define the 4th missing element as material, and material is basically the resonant potential material contained within the pieces as defined by the table of material value. Now what that means in real simple terms is every piece is a battery, and it will only release all of its energy or most of its energy when it's placed on a very good square. And that's a very simple definition of my concept of material. And also, too, you know, everyone knows, you know, that chess is a war of material, and that if you have 3 or 4 more pawns than your opponent, then generally you can win pretty easily once you get down to a king and pawn ending. So that's a very basic idea that's contained within chess, and even beginners recognize that. So because chess is a war of space-time, force, material, then this move g4 is a very good move because it greatly restricts black's opportunities on the king side, because it takes away space and thus squares from the black pieces, i.e. this bishop on c8 is never going to the f5 square because this pawn would simply capture it. So anyway, g4, black castles, bishop g2, and now that the bishop, you know, now that this pawn moves, notice also too, now white has a bishop, you know, square to develop his light squared bishop on. We already talked about the bishop would like to be on maybe this diagonal here, but since this diagonal, it's just not practically possible to get the bishop over there, so the bishop gets on the long diagonal where there's a lot of, and also helps enforce the e3, e4 pawn break. So bishop g2, knight a5. That's a move I may not have played. I mean, maybe I would have gotten around to it. Maybe yes, maybe no. But to me, it's a very simple move. The ideas here is simply to exploit this weakened b3 square. Knight a5 is the first choice of the computer, so that's not surprising. Carlsen many times will make the #1 choice of all the chess engines, and I have Fritz this. You know, I've ran Fritz over this engine, I've ran Houdini by this game, and I've ran, you know, several of the other engines, Deep Shredder, Stockfish, Ribka, etc., etc., etc. And just about all the engines here like the move knight a5. I might have played bishop to d7 first, and the idea there being to play knight a5 and then maybe queen e8 and bishop a4, trying to, you know, really dominate these light squares on the queen side. But maybe bishop d7 is too slow and it takes away, it kind of blocks the queen in. And also too, it's possible that as soon as you play knight a5, white will play a4, and then, you know, this pawn here will prevent the bishop d7 a4 move. And if that maneuver is prevented, then you know, maybe this bishop d7 isn't such a strong idea there. But anyway, here Carlsen plays move 11, knight a5. Again, the idea is to simply anchor a knight here on the b3 square, and also too to expand on the queen side. And also too, another idea is obviously white wants to play a game with a lot of the pieces on the board, and Carlsen being there's a practical aspect to this position. Carlsen's 2 points ahead in the match. All he needs is, you know, a couple more draws and the title's his. So knight a5 is a very logical move from the practical aspect of chess, in that all he needs to do is trade off a few more pieces, simplify the position, and greatly take a lot of the energy out of white's position, and that's also to his favor because of his standing in the match, as the match stands at the start of this game. So anyway, knight a5, white castles. Of course, now we have the 4 basic you know, principles of the opening, and I like to teach these because a lot of lower rated players simply do not know them. If they're new to chess or beginners or never really studied chess, they may not understand these principles. Every grandmaster knows them and practices them. In fact, you can just turn the 4 basic principles into questions and ask them, and basically they are, you know, control the center, develop your pieces quickly toward the middle of the board, protect the king and castle early, 2-part equation, and the last one is maintain a material balance unless you're playing a gambit, i.e. square control. And, you know, we can just ask those 4 questions. Did both sides control the center? And the answer is yes. Did both sides, you know, develop their pieces relatively quickly? Again, the answer is yes, as quickly as they possibly could. Did both sides protect their king and castle early? Again, the answer is yes. And did both sides maintain the material balance? And again, the answer is yes. I think right now we've only exchanged like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 1 set of pawns and 1 set of minor pieces. So that's all that's been exchanged off. So again, we can see the you know, grandmasters, no matter what the opening is, they're always going to do those 4 basic principles of chess in the opening. In other words, controlling. And the way I teach my students is to remember the little acronym of chess develops powerful minds. C is control the center. D, develop your pieces as quickly and as rapidly. Off the back rank, think of chess as a race to get your pieces out. P is protect the king and castle early, always remembering that it's a 2-part equation. And then the last one is maintain the material balance, i.e. square control. So, you know, those are the 4 main ideas that are contained within every opening. And now Carlsen plays 12, knight b3. Again, that's, you know, there's a number of moves here that the engines like. H6 was also attractive to black. The idea being forever stopping this pawn from any idea of traveling up the board and kicking the knight off its best square. So that was a very very attractive move at that point. So there was a couple of moves. Bishop d7 with the idea of queen e8 again is possible there. That might be a very good move. b5 was another possibility there because, you know, then the knight travels forward. But Carlsen just plays the simplest move, which is knight b3, not leaving the knight on the edge of the board, because a knight on, everyone knows the old saying, most grandmasters anyway, they know the concept that putting a knight on the edge of the board temporarily is okay, but a lot of beginners tend to move, and even middle class players will move a knight toward the edge of the board and then forget about it. They'll leave it on the rim of the board, and that's what has developed the old saying that a knight on the rim is grim and its prospects are dim. So just try to remember that little saying. You can always remember that. Carlsen plays the Fritz best move, knight b3, which immediately also forks the bishop and the rook and also gets the knight off the edge of the board. Allows black to probably expand, play moves like a5 and b5, expand on the queen side. Also, he's doing a fork here. He's hitting both white's bishop and white's rook. So white plays rook a2, and now notice black doesn't swap off immediately. He doesn't have to. A lot of players want to exchange off immediately. They think every time they're presented with an exchange that they have to exchange, or they always swap material. Here, Carlsen understands that this knight on b3 rather is a monster, and you know, until white can challenge it with knight c1, that knight can stay there just as long as it wants. Also, too, there's a lot of time and energy invested in this knight. It's moved 1, 2, 3 times to get to its current square. Black should not be in a big hurry to swap this piece off. Black plays b5. That's a very good move there. Fritz 13 likes bishop d7 and h6. Those seem to be the top two choices of the Fritz 13 engine, which is, you know, I'm running that in the background just to avoid any tactical mistakes and also to give you some input on what the engine might hear. b5 is very logical. Again, black's expanding for space on the queen side. White plays knight g3. Anand is playing a very simple idea here. Anand's idea is really simple. He's playing what I like to call caveman chess. He's just going to put all of his pieces and move them over to the king side as quickly as possible and try to make something happen in this game. He probably doesn't like to be reduced to that level of chess, but he really has to, because if he doesn't produce a decisive result in his favor in this game in such a short match, again, this is already game 9. The match is only going to go 12 games. And, you know, him being 2 games behind, he basically has to start winning something. So basically that's what Anand is forced to do. You know, he's probably not real happy about it, but, you know, his hand is pretty much forced at this point. So white's playing, you know, knight g3. Again, the idea being transfer all the pieces over to the king side and try to start some kind of king side attack. Black plays a5. Carlsen's one thing I have noticed about Carlsen is he's very, very linear. And by linear, I mean once he starts on an idea, he generally pursues that idea very quickly and very logically. Maybe he doesn't always play the engine best move. In fact, let me tell you a little story here real quickly. A while back, it's been maybe 2 years ago, one very avid fan, he's a fan of my web pages, he sent me an email and said, AJ, I think Carlsen's playing computer chess by remote control. Too often, too much of the time, he makes maybe the very best engine move in the critical positions, and he just felt like absolutely positively that Carlsen was somehow playing chess via remote control. I can tell you positively, absolutely, that is not the case. And the reason I'm able to say that is I've subjected about 100 of Carlsen's games to extremely deep analysis, and I will tell you, while most of the time he does make the engine move, occasionally he'll miss an engine move, and a lot of times it's a very important move. And if you would like to see a game, an example of this, please go to my website for the game of the month. Just Google or use Bing to search for game of the month and find chess, and I'm sure you're going to find my website. But go to my game of the month website and find my game between Carlsen and Nakamura from the Tata Wikon Z January 2013 tournament, and you're going to find there that I analyzed that game with the idea of trying to determine whether or not Carlsen was playing chess via remote control. In other words, did he always make the best engine move, i.e. Stockfish, Rybka, Houdini, Fritz, etc., or is, you know, he a human player, and once in a while he would miss the absolutely best move? And I can tell you, after closely analyzing at least 100 of his games, maybe even a little bit more than that, I've gone back in the database and looked at, you know, dozens and dozens of his games, and I can tell you that while he is a very strong player, certainly worthy of his 2,800 plus rating, he does not always make the best move according to the engines. But however, he is a very linear player. And by linear player, I mean once he embarks on a logical idea, he generally pursues that idea to its conclusion, and very rarely does he get sidetracked. And in that regard, he reminds me very much about Alekhine. Alekhine was famous for his tactics, but a lot of players don't realize, I guess if they've never really subjected his games to deep study, they also don't realize that he also was a very linear player. And by linear, he would start on a certain idea. Very often it would be an attack, but oftentimes there were other concepts there too. But once he started an idea, he generally did not let a lot of things sidetrack him. And so in that concept, and also Fischer was also a very logical and linear player as well, and also a very classical player. He always seemed to, like in Ray Lopez, Bobby Fischer would always interpret those positions, exchanging on e5 or c5 as white and the Ray Lopez or Spanish, and then stick a knight on d5. In that regard, he reminds me very much of Capablanca, very much a classical player. So anyway, but these are just some things I have noticed about Carlsen's style, and here he's pursuing the logical concept of just general queenside expansion, and he's continuing on that and doesn't let anything sidetrack him. I might have gotten sidetracked with h6 because this pawn nudge to g5 bothers me very much. The idea of my knight getting bumped off its very best square would bother me a lot, and I don't think black should allow that, but at the same time, Carlsen's not afraid to allow things like that. White does now indeed play the g5 bump and knocks the knight off the best square. Black goes knight e8. That's an important square to make. A lot of players wanted to play the knight to d7, but e8 is absolutely the best move, and we're going to see in a minute exactly why he had to go to e8 and why that's the best square. And indeed, Fritz says that that's and a couple of the other engines, I think Houdini and Deep Shredder also show that that's the #1 move after doing an overnight analysis with that move. But anyway, knight e8 doesn't look like the most logical move. I would say if you're going to pursue in this position after g5, if I were black, if I wanted to be just apply, this shows you how chess logic doesn't always work. To me here, chess logic indicates that this knight, white's playing on the king side, black should be playing on the queen side, and that's what he's doing with these pawn expansion here. Seems to me if you're applying pure chess logic, that the black knight should go to d7 and then go to the b6 square. Just let me quickly highlight that b6 square. And now you can see that's the square that I would be tempted to try to maneuver the knight to. And to me, that's the idea there. The idea is to get the knight to that square after the g5 move. In other words, after g5, to try to bring this knight back to d7 to get it to b6. However, Carlsen realizes here that he might need this knight on the king side for defense, and that's why he played it to the correct square, knight e8, because basically white's going to try to do attacking moves, like maybe pushing the pawn to f6 and getting a queen to h6, and he may need the knight on e8 to prevent a checkmate on the g7 square. And Carlsen foresees that all very quickly. In fact, an experienced player can tell you that white's going to do what I call a bum's rush on the king side. He's just going to shove his pawns on the king side as far forward as the position will allow them to try to make something happen, and that's coming, and black has to be prepared to meet that. So white plays 16 e4 here. And now black plays knight takes c1. See, now here's the idea. I think Carlsen is very logical. Now that this bishop suddenly might have an out and might get out and cause problems, now Carlsen just quickly nips it off. Knight takes c1, queen takes c1. Also displaces the white queen. The white queen probably wanted to come over to the h5 square and join in the attack. So now it takes one more tempo for the white queen to get back on this d1 h5 diagonal. So that's another positive side of Carlsen's knight takes c1 move. All right, and now black plays rook a6. The correct move according to the engine is rook b8. I would be very much tempted to play that move there, because then you're looking at b4, maybe just shoving a passed pawn all the way up the board if white allows it. But rook b8 looked very logical to me. However, Carlsen, and that's the first move choice at least right now of the engine Fritz 13. However, Carlsen plays rook a6. That's also a very logical move. Again, the idea is get the the rook off this diagonal is once white starts shoving these pawns up, eventually this bishop's going to become unleashed. Once that happens, the rook doesn't want to be sitting on the A8 square where it's going to be hanging. So it's good to get that rook off that square as quickly as possible. Also, too, the idea of the rook on A6 is maybe it can come to the third rank and add to the defense. In other words, after rook A6, maybe black can play H6, and if pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn, and then maybe he can follow that up with queen H4. And if white's not too careful, he might wind up having problems trying to defend this H2 square. So there's all kinds of ideas there. But anyway, that's just some of the ideas there. And white plays E5 here. Now E5, I'm not really too sure about E5. Right now I'm running Fritz 13, and the engine Fritz 13 wants to play F4 there. And I've also run this by Houdini 2.0. And Houdini, after an overnight analysis, I think it also preferred to move 18 F3, F4 there. Anand plays E5 there. That was a critical move. Moment. I'm not saying E5 is wrong. It's another strong attacking move. But if you're going to play a player as strong as Carlsen, then a lot of times you have to find the most precise move at every opportunity. So maybe F4 was slightly stronger than E5. Carlsen plays knight C7. This is a very simple idea here. The idea is to redeploy. This knight's going to come around to C7 and then the E6. And what that's going to do is try to bolster up and also guard some key squares. The knight on C7 guards the rook on A6, guards B5, guards D5, etc. So, the knight's a little bit more useful on the C7 square than it was on the E8 square. White plays F4. Now, once more here, we're looking at Fritz 13 wants to play the move H6. I don't know why Carlsen didn't play that. Only Carlsen can answer that. There are some drawbacks to H6. H6 is going to be opening lines on the king side, and in this position, that's generally what white wants. He wants to open up a few more lines on the king side. So Carlsen may be avoiding that simply on general principle. The idea is that he's not going to inflict any open lines on himself on the king side, that if white wants a line open on the king side, he's going to have to do that himself. Here Carlsen plays the move 19b4. Again, the Fritz move, the engine move there, is to play h6. But now, well, actually, now it's switching over to b4. So b4 is also a very strong move. So b4, that's a very good move there, because it's obviously a very logical move. It's putting pressure. It's threatening to just shove this pawn to b3. And once white gets the pawn to b3, then white has a protected black rather has a white can't allow this pawn to go to b3. That's what I wanted to say. Once this pawn gets to b3, then black can never, white rather can never play for an endgame, because all endgames will simply be won for black simply because he has a protected passed pawn on the b3 square, and all king and pawn endings are just a flat-out win for black. So anyway, b4, that's a very strong move. White plays a takes b4, a takes b4. Now here, if I were white, I would have played rook a1 to f, rook on a2 to f2. And the reason I would do that is mostly the standing in the match. I think white's got to keep as much tension on the board and keep as much material on the board. And win, lose, or draw, he's got to make something happen. And the only way he's going to do that is play really strong moves, play the best moves that he can, avoid exchanges, and try to make something happen on the chessboard. Rook a6 is the first move of the engine. Rook takes a6. It's the very first move of the engine. But this was also a strong attacking line for white. Raf2, b takes c3, queen takes c3, bishop d7. And here I think white's got some real chances in this position. And I like this position a little bit better than the one that Anand found himself in, simply because if you swap too many pieces, it becomes very difficult to make something happen. But and white's got to go for a positive result here. Anand had to try something here. Also, too, rather than f4 here, the computer likes right now. Fritz 13 is liking moving the rook on rook f to f2. I don't understand that move at all. I might play rook a to f2, but anyway. So f4, b4, a takes b4, a takes b4. Again, Anand plays, again, a top engine move. He plays rook takes a6. The main idea being that white does not want to lose time. I don't like that move so much because too many pieces have now become exchanged. And now black plays knight takes a6. And now his knight, is supporting the pawn on b4. It's threatening pawn to b3. I really think white should have played b3 takes, c3 takes b4 here. in my opinion, long term, white couldn't allow the pawn to go to b3. Once the pawn gets to b3, then, you know, white has to concede all in games are just flat out wins for black. And I don't think Anand in this position in the match could do that. But he plays f5, which is the most aggressive move. He's going forward on the king side. The plus to that move, it's very sharp, and it's also the first engine move. The drawback to that move is that he must win the game with an all-out attack on the king side, because, you know, failing that, everything else is the end game after b3 is certainly going to favor black. And of course, Carlsen plays b3, and that is the first move of Fritz also. And Fritz, believe it or not, currently evaluates this position as completely normal here. Now here, Anand plays queen f4. I'm not sure about that move at all. That may be one of the first times that Anand played close to a fairly inaccurate move here. It's not a terrible move. I mean, sooner or later, if white wants to make an attack, he has to get the queen over to the queen side. But right now, Fritz and I think Houdini also like the move 23 knight h5. That was moving this knight on g3 to h5. That would have been a very strong move. But here, Anand plays 23 queen f4. And now black plays knight back to c7. Again, he's seeing that, you know, the need for this knight to be on the e8 square, protect g7 from checkmate. f6. Naturally, the last thing, the worst thing black could do is play b2 here and allow this f takes g7. I think if that happens, black might be lost, or white at least has real winning chances. I mean, that's just too strong a thing to allow. White might play knight h5 and f6, and black's position could literally just fall apart in a handful of moves. So even though black's not happy about it, he has to play the move g6 here. He's got to keep the lines closed and not allow his pawn cover in front of his king to be tore wide open. And actually here the computer likes the move g takes f6. And that gets into a very complicated line. We'll just briefly analyze that because that was more interesting than g6, but it might have been the engine move, and it might have even been a slight improvement over the game. G takes f6, knight h5, f takes g5, knight f6 check, king h8, queen takes g5, and now knight e8. Maybe Anand avoided this because looks like more pieces are going to get swapped, and the game should be a draw. Or actually, that's what Carlsen wanted. He was the one that played g6. Maybe g6 wasn't the best move there. G takes f6 looks like a fairly significant improvement, and again, that would be an argument for that to clearly show Carlsen's. I 100% believe with all my heart that Carlsen is not a cheater, and this would be a very good example of that, because G takes f6 might actually be a slightly more accurate move than g6. I had looked at that with Houdini also the other day, and that might lead to exchanges and a draw, and I think that's what Carlsen wants here. g6 is actually maybe slightly a dubious move, because I was analyzing with Deep Shredder, and that causes the engine, the yellow warning light, to come on, and maybe that's actually a bad move there. Maybe g takes f6 was slightly better there. I will say it's counter-logical. Normally the defender does not want to open lines. He wants to keep as many lines closed here, but g6 might have been not the move. Fritz 13 at least is showing that g takes f6 was the indicated move, but Carlsen played g6 there. And again, white goes queen h4. Now it's a very simple idea. We see the lay of the land more or less has been set. I mean, the pawn structure determines the lay of the land, and white's going to play queen h4, and if black can't stop the mating threat, then he's looking at mate threats here. I don't think after black wants to play king h8 here. In fact, let's just analyze that for a second. King h8, in the game, Carlsen played knight e8, which is the correct move according to the Fritz engine. But if king h8, it's simply horrible. In fact, that's a double question mark move. A student of mine had written me and said he thought king h8 was better than the actual game, and I had severe doubts even before I used an engine to analyze that line. But anyway, king h8 is losing by force. Fritz 13 goes from a slight plus to white, seeing mate in 9, plus minus mate in 9, and after queen h6, rook g8 to stop the mate, rook f4. Now white's already threatening the mate in 2. If you've never seen this mating pattern before, it's quite shocking. But if you're regular to the Chess Games website, you've seen this pattern literally dozens, if not hundreds of times. And the threat now is queen h7 check, king takes h7, rook h4 checkmate. So, black's already got to do something about that threat, and that's the main threat. And I don't think that in this position, black has any defense to that other than playing giveaway. Rather than this rook g8 move, Fritz says knight e6 was a better move. That was actually maybe a slightly better line than what happened in the game, was knight e6 there. And now white can play rook f4. Obviously, you can't play knight takes rook because that's answered by queen g7 mate. Sorry, I didn't mean to try to move the piece there, but I was just showing that knight takes f4. That's not a mistake. It's a very sharp move. And now, let's see, after knight e6, rook f4. Again, the threat is queen takes check and rook h4 checkmate. And, you know, basically black has got to come up with a way of stopping that. I'm not sure he has any way of really stopping that. In this position, well, Fritz is showing it's a forced mate in 6, and black is forced to give up the queen with queen takes f6. And after e takes f6, rook e8, which is just ridiculous because now white just goes rook h4, king g8, queen takes f7 check, king f8, queen h8 mate. And the computer says all that is forced. So that king h8, that's a very bad move. I'm going to give that a double question mark and just let it go at that. But so anyway, after 25 in the actual game, going back to the actual game, Fritz is still showing g takes f6 to be correct. Carlsen played 24 g6. White played queen h4. Black played knight e8. Again, the idea is that's the forced move. Black, you know, yes, black must be prepared to defend. You know, after queen h6, black's got to stop this mate here on the g7 square. And white goes ahead and plays queen h6. And now Carlsen, he's a rather crafty little fellow. I gotta hand it to him. He's very resourceful. He's very good at tactics, and he finds, you know, maybe the only way out. I think Anand against just about any other grandmaster alive, he might have mated him. Black would have made a mistake in the defense. But Carlsen is such a cold-blooded defender. He basically does what he must have ice water in his veins. But he doesn't ever seem to get upset. I mean, you know, most of us, when threatened with mate in just a few moves, you know, it's very easy for us to fall apart. But Carlsen always seems to handle such situations with such grace and such coolness. You could call him the cool hand Luke of chess. I hereby dub Magnus Carlsen the cool hand Luke of chess. So anyway, white plays queen h6, and now Carlsen, the crafty little defender that he is, he plays b2 there. And the idea of this is black's going to make an extra queen. You know, his idea is to play queen a5 and queen a1 and make an extra queen. Now, you know, Anand's doing, again, he's playing caveman chess. He's trying to get all of his pieces over to the king side. He's trying to go to rook to over here and give a checkmate. And, you know, of course, Carlsen makes a new queen, promotes to the queen. And now this is the critical moment of the game. This is where Anand, I thought he had a win or had very clear attacking chances. I caught the tail end of this game one morning right before I was sending my girls off to the school. There's about a 12-hour difference, a 10 to 12-hour difference between Chennai, India, and where I live in Pensacola, Florida. But I caught the tail end of this game, and I thought that, you know, Anand had real winning chances here. I was not running an engine at the time in the background, but I really thought that, you know, white had real winning chances in this position. He played knight f1. In this position, he played knight f1. That was a complete and total blunder. You could give that, you know, a double question mark. In fact, we should probably just go ahead and order that 2 question marks. The correct move there was bishop to f1. And, you know, I thought that possibly that, you know, Anand was winning there if he played that, but that's not the case. Of course, the only move for black is to play queen d1 exclam. That's the only move there, and that's the move that's forced. And now white plays rook h4. The queen's got to give back. I mean, white is threatening queen takes pawn checkmate on the very move here. So the only move to stop that is to play queen h5. And now knight takes h5, g takes h5, rook takes h5, once again threatening this mate on the h7 square, but now black has bishop to f5 here. And I think the best move there, if I remember the Chessbase analysis, was g6. And after bishop takes g6, also interesting there was rook h3 after bishop f5. Bishop h3 is also an interesting move for white. But anyway, g6 I think was the critical line. And after bishop takes g6, rook g5, and now white's threatening to win. He's threatening to play h4, h5, takes here and pry open a line here, if you can ever get his bishop back here and sack here, he has real winning chances. But white can prevent all that. I mean, black can prevent all that with very simply here. Well, Fritz 13 is showing queen a5 there. Another line, too, that was analyzed on a lot of websites is simply give back the material. I mean, one thing that, you know, white's got a very promising attack. And with this knight here, this rook can never move. So basically a lot of black's material is useless with the current situation on the chessboard. So very logic dictates that black can just give back some of the material and reach a nice equal position, and that is knight takes f6, e takes f6. Queen takes f6, and now probably just simply rook takes d5. And in this position, you know, it's dead drawn. I mean, both sides have 3 pawns. White's king is wide open. I think the fact that white's king is wide open. In a normal game, if white had a nice covered king, he could play ideas like rook c4 and win this pawn here and have real winning chances in the endgame. He could run 2 connectors up the board. But A, there's too much material on the board. B, his own king is too exposed, so I don't think practically there's any chance of that happening. In fact, Fritz 13, after several minutes of analyzing this position, it's showing a status of 0.00, and anytime you see that engine evaluation, you can generally take it to the bank that that's a drawn position. I mean, it's just dead drawn. Computers saying that numerically speaking, there isn't any ghost of a chance for either side to have any realistic chances at trying to win the game. It's a totally balanced position, and I would have to agree to that. Anyway, back to this game. I don't remember exactly what the time was going on. You can watch the video. The complete video of that round is available if you go to the Chessbase link for this game, and I will post that link, you know, on the just below the little box that says show more. I'm posting all both the link for the replay page on the Chess Games website, and also to the analysis, the Chessbase article. And the Chessbase article has lots of good stuff in there. It's got an analysis of the game that you can download for free. It's got a lot of other stuff, but anyway, it pretty much shows everything. But back to the game: queen h6, b2, rook f4, b1, queen. Here, you know, Anand just blundered completely. He played 28 knight f1, double question mark, and after queen e1, you know, exclam. I mean, it's just a very simple move, maybe something Anand overlooked. And now if rook h4, just simply queen takes h4, and the checkmate's been prevented. And sooner or later, black's got to untangle his position and win the game with his extra material. I mean, it's just got to happen. One thing can happen is, you know, this knight and rook will never move, but, you know, the queen's not going to be enough to break through this kingside position. And in fact, after rook h4, queen takes h4, queen takes h4, black can play h5, and if pawn takes pawn en passant, then king h7, and all the mating threats have been averted. And in that case, white's just a whole rook down. And after queen e1, you know, Anand almost immediately resigned. He realized that he had made some kind of mistake, and he handed in the game. This win here in this game, in game 9, gave Magnus Carlsen an almost insurmountable lead of 3 points. I mean, at this point, there was like 3 games left. 10, 11, and 12, and just to draw the match, Anand would have had to win out. And the way the games were being played, you know, the last few games, they'd completely gone in Magnus Carlsen's favor, and that I didn't see any practical chance of Anand winning out. He might win 1 or even 2 of those games, but there was just no way he was going to win out and win all 3 games, not unless just Carlsen collapsed. And again, Carlsen's just too good a player. He's not that nervy. He's not like an Ivanchuk or even a Kasparov. I mean, his nerves don't bother him seemingly hardly at all, at least not at his current age. But there wasn't any chance of that happening. I really thought Anand might win 1 of the last 3 games, but there was no way he was going to win all 3. And so after this game, basically now the match is over. You know, in fact, they drew the very next game, and Carlsen goes on to become a world champion. Now, this video has run a little bit longer than a lot of the other games, and one of the reasons I wanted to analyze this game a little bit better was, number one, I think there were a lot of mistakes made in the analysis, online analysis of the game. And this is not because they're so terrible, it's just because I've had days and days and days, and I've looked at everybody else's analysis and used many different engines to analyze this game. They were trying to analyze the game just in a matter of maybe, you know, just a few minutes to an hour and post something on the internet as quickly as possible. And when you analyze that quickly, it's only natural that you might make a mistake, especially with a game as complicated as this one was. So I'd spent a lot more time. My original goal for all the games was to generally, especially in the draws, to not run more than 15 minutes. But in this game, I broke that rule simply because I felt like this game merited the attention. It was a very crucial game, and in fact, in many ways, this game and Game 5 are the two decisive games of the match. I mean, this absolutely had to be the straw that broke the camel's back, I think, and it showed on Anand's face. If you watch the post-game interview of this match, you will see that Anand very clearly, you could see it in his face, that he just knew that the match was over. There wasn't any question about it as soon as he resigned. I mean, the sick look on his face, I mean, at this point, I think he already knew that he was not going to be world champion anymore. So anyway, that concludes my coverage of this game, and also my coverage, of the match. There's one more game. I'll do the last video, but that's not going to be near as long or near as complicated as this game. I did want this game to be relatively complete, somewhat more thorough than some of the other analysis I had seen on various websites. And also, too, I wanted to cover a few more of the other aspects of chess, like match strategy and things of that sort, playing style and those type of things that maybe other different annotators had not addressed. That pretty much does it for my video for Game 9 of the 2013 World Championship match. Thank you for watching my video. If you like my videos and would like to support my webpage efforts and my videos, then please go to the PayPal website. That's www.paypal.com, and make a contribution under my email address, which is LifeMasterAJ@yahoo.com. Thank you for watching my video, and have a great day.